Ainda não.
Ainda não, doutora. Daqui a pouquinho o Gustavo já vem falar quando tiver alguém.
Aí o link ele manda para o André, né?
Manda, pode deixar.
Perfeito.
Doutor, estamos ao vivo.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our seminar, Blockchain and Governance, one of several events organized during the week to celebrate the Lawyers' Day. I am Dayana Uhdre, and I will be conducting our meeting today for this afternoon. Before we start our meeting, I have to apologize to our guests, but I have to give some necessary information for all the participants. As our public is mostly Brazilians, I will use the Portuguese language, but if you are watching us outside from Brazil, you can also contribute to our campaign to raise funds to acquire COVID tests to our medical and nurse teams that are working in front of hospitals, especially the public one. The QR code is available on the screen. Bom, pessoal, boa tarde a todos. Com prazer que nós estamos aqui dando início aos trabalhos. E antes da gente passar as palavras, né, para os nossos palestrantes, eu gostaria de dar 2 informações necessárias. A primeira é que a gente tem que falar que a OAB Paraná, juntamente com o IAP, né, o Instituto de Advogados do Paraná, estão realizando a campanha Advocacia contra a Pandemia, com o objetivo de reunir recursos para compra de testes para diagnóstico da Covid-19, que estão sendo doados para as equipes médicas e os enfermeiros que estão nas frentes de trabalho junto aos hospitais. Graças à ajuda da advocacia, 3 hospitais no interior do Paraná já foram beneficiados com a campanha. O nosso foco agora é arrecadar recursos para entregar testes ao Hospital de Clínicas conectado à Universidade Federal do Paraná, aqui do nosso querido estado, né? Vocês também podem fazer parte dessa corrente de solidariedade. Só acessar esse QR Code que está aparecendo aí na tela de vocês e utilizar, né, fazer a sua doação através do aplicativo PicPay. A segunda informação relevante é para aqueles que estejam presentes e têm interesse de receber os certificados de participação, não deixem de preencherem os questionários que estarão disponíveis no chat, tanto aqui da plataforma Zoom, quanto da plataforma do YouTube, ok? É isso, vou ter que voltar agora para os nossos convidados e dar início aos trabalhos. Well, returning to our seminar, Blockchain and Governance, I think that the theme chosen to be addressed right now is one of the most challenging ones, because when you are talking about blockchain and thinking about governance in blockchain, after all, we are talking about structural and principal aspects of how things on and off platforms should work. So to deal with some issues of this fascinating subject, we invited 3 specialists, professors, and respected professionals who very generously agreed to be here with us for the next few hours. So I would like to express our thanks for the availability of your time to share with us a little of your knowledge of these subjects. Whatever, before giving the floor to our guests, let me explain to you how the things will work. During the explanations, it is possible to the listeners direct questions to our guests directly on the chat, even or on Zoom or YouTube platforms. Our colleague, André Cardoso, will be selecting some questions for us. At the end of the explanations, we will bring some of these questions to debate with our professors. Well, since you didn't come here to hear me, let me introduce you to the panelists. Filippo Zatti, Morshed Mannan, and Sophie Nappert good evening for you, because I know that in Europe right now it's 7 p.m., right?
Yeah, absolutely. Boa tarde.
Boa tarde, exato. It's a really immense pleasure and privilege to have you all here with us this afternoon. So thanks again for you three. And I will start with Professor Filippo Zatti, who will talk a little bit about democratization of blockchain governance vis-a-vis legal notion of sovereignty. Filippo Zatti, well, your curriculum is really enormous, so I pick some information. Could be because it's enormous, and we can.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. He's associate professor of economic law, University of Florence, Italy, coordinator of research unit named Blockchains and Artificial Intelligence for Business Economics and Law, aka Babel, and he professor of Banking and Capital Market Law and Economic Law at School of Economics and Management of the same university. He's a member of plenty of numbers of organizations connected to blockchain and technology. So you can explain your research, take your time, and this space is all yours for the next 25 minutes. So be comfortable to share something with us. Thank you so much, Professor Filippo.
Thank you very much, Diana, for the invitation. It is a great pleasure to be here, and also thank to Professor Cardoso. Both of you have organized this great opportunity to discuss about one of the most fascinating issues, as you told, that is blockchain governance. Yes, as you can see from the slide on my right side, I just want to ask the listener, is just a question. My speech is about a question of sovereignty. I ask this question to all of you because I see many connections between blockchain as a system and law as a legal system. So the first point that I want to address, yes, okay, is the notion of governance. Because many times when I join to this kind of discussion, I hear that governance is given as known. The notion is governance used to be known by the listeners or the speakers, but I think it's not so good to avoid to face this problem, because governance has many meanings, many meanings. It depends on the not only the issue, but the view that you have. If you consider governance in economic way, you have a specific definition. If you consider, for example, in specific sectors of law, you have many different. Think of commercial law, business law, you have corporate governance. But if you think of international law, you have the governance of the global system. So it's very difficult to have a single definition of governance. And to me, it's very important also to define blockchain governance. I think we have two distinct meanings, very wide, the opposite sides. On one side, we have a specific phenomenon or institution and how it de facto works, the set of rules the participants of the governance of the system give, and how these rules and the subjects, the participants to the system, govern or regulate it. it sounds like something similar to the law of privates. You have specific rules for that kind of system, and you need to govern with particular models that are quite different from the public ones, where there is the authority. You can have also the authority in this case, but here you make the emergency of private interests. I think this is the most relevant aspect of this wide definition. On the other side, we have an international way to interpret, to conceive governance. And in this case, you have more specific institutional dynamics which contribute. There is not only one. As you know, there are many examples, WTO and so on, to forging legal rules. We have the phenomenon of soft law, and the other phenomena we have obviously the international law and the treaties, but there is not an authority in a strict sense. And also you have the problem to have an harmonization or standardization of these rules in order to promote cross-border interactions. These wide two definitions are taken from a book of a distinguished colleague, Italian colleague, is a sociologist, and his name is Maria Rosaria Ferrarese, in the Governance between Politics and Law. Which of these two wide definitions we can apply to blockchain, and specifically to blockchain platform? I don't want to go into deep, because I think that many of our listeners, of our public, know this aspect. You know that you have many different types of blockchain platforms, and you know that you have the same old story that the blockchain platforms can be permissioned or private, permissionless, or consortium, or even hybrid of those two systems. But what is important to me
Tô com vontade, sabe do que? De abrir o vídeo.
Vinicius Saskida is talking. I don't know in Portuguese because I don't understand. So if...
Sorry. Yeah, now
Okay.
he's not talking anymore. Sorry for the interruption.
Absolutely. It could be a good interruption if you want to ask me a question about what I said. In this case, I don't know if you know these distinctions, but you have what? Only in one case, the permissionless type of blockchain, you have a decentralization of authority. It's difficult to point out one single authority in the permissionless, because as many computer scientists name it, is the pure form of blockchain, in the sense that decentralization is achieved as the premium, as an important factor. In the other case, in the other three types of blockchain platforms, you have the same classification that you find in the legal theory. So you have a kind of, if not single, a group of subjects that have the authority to impose power or rules. You have rules that behave as law, as legislation, and also have something similar to the enforcement. And we come back to the point at the end of my speech about that, because also, yes, in the blockchain, also in this case, we have something that is not typically or is not similarly considered as enforcement. In the permissionless, the most famous, you know, what is the permissionless, the most famous, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others. Recently is very, very famous Algorand, for example. There are different kind of mechanism of government or governance of these blockchains, and there are all open sources and permissionless. So you have all the characteristics that you can read directly by yourselves that are very typical of this kind of technology. And especially one is very important to us. To remove the third one, the capability, theoretic capability, to remove human agency in order to eliminate arbitrary and through arbitrary also corruption or inconsistent enforcement of rules. That is a great problem, especially in the globalized world. So as a consequence, we have two effects. We have in this kind, specifically talking about public blockchain, we have a governance by network and a governance of network. A governance by network is very simple to understand because some way is similar to what happened in the physical system. Governance of network is the very problem, is the true problem that we have, because we have something different from the physical world, in the sense that here the actors or the participants to the network voluntarily or not, it depends on the rules given by the governance by network, produce, maintain, or change the inputs that make up a blockchain. So you know the different possibility that you have as a participant. You can be an holder of a token of a crypto asset, or can be a validator as a miner and participate to be a node in the strict sense, to participate to what? To the governance of the platform. So we have the first aspect. I don't know, I don't want to take too much time, so I control the clock. We have the first paradox in order to what I have said until now. Was a sociologist of the Oxford, University of Oxford Internet Institute, Willy Ledonvirta, that proposes 3-4 years ago, I don't remember exactly, a governance paradox. He said, with reference specifically to public blockchain, there is a paradox because you have a voluntary agreement, so you can fail to solve disputes. At the same time, when networks adopt formal or informal governance structures, they are no longer truly decentralized. So we come back to the same model to have a sort of authority and a centralized power. This is a great problem because I don't have the time, and I'm not strictly connected to these points. I don't know if my colleagues, the other panelists, are going to talk about that, but they are very important, the pool of the miners and the widespread the diffusion of, it depends on the mechanism of the governance, but it's very important to know what is the widespread of the propriety of the token of the crypto asset issued by the platform. And we face the first problem The first problem is governance is something useful to guarantee democracy, because as all we know, and we think to the origins of blockchain at the roots of the cyberpunk phenomenon, and also if you think to the origin block of Bitcoin issued on the January 3rd, blockchain was considered as a tool in order to avoid the inefficiency of the economic system and all the regulation of the politics. So we have a problem in this case, in the sense that governance is something that could be a threat for the democratic deficit, but obviously could be some way more effective, especially for economics, than representative democracy. So is blockchain something useful or not to guarantee democracy, as the founders, also the unknown Satoshi Nakamoto, wanted? Or blockchain is the ultimate the last step toward the authoritarianism? It reminds to me of a Carl Schmitt view of politics. The search for neutrality is some ways impossible, because also if you have technique application, you do politics. So if we move from these points, we can say that both democracy and blockchain are methods for decentralized power. But as you know, democracy is rooted on a most important principle, that is the rule of law. What about blockchain? Blockchain seems to not to have a uniform, to be uniform, but to be distinguished in order to the reasons why it is created, it is originated. So we have different blockchain for currency, business, we have different use cases around the world. Finance, we have DeFi, decentralized finance, so on. And we have, through the rule of code, we arrive to another form of consensus recently named by William Magnusson in his book, Blockchain Democracy, the rule of crowd. And something very interesting, because the crowd reminds us of citizenship in some way. So in the crowd, we think there is a sort of inefficiency. It is better to have the first choice, to have one man chief in command, as in the presidential system, for example. In the blockchain, we have a system very complicated of governance, because there is the tendency to search for a form of power, very, very technical, untouchable power, made transparent at the beginning of the form of the governance, when the governance is originated. But at the same time, we have the need to have many nodes in order to guarantee the decentralization. In the computer science, the most important till now ways to govern blockchain platforms are the Byzantine fault scheme, the proof of work, the proof of stake, and the delegated proof of stake. The most famous and the most used is the proof of work, even if now is most important the proof of stake for the energy problems that are related to the use of the other kind of governance. for the first time, we face with one specific problem of the governance for blockchain, very specific and very different from the physical world. The need to have a consensus without an agreement. The consensus is given by an algorithm. So here, the concept of majority, as we have in democracy, changes, because it's not anymore to have the minority 49%, the majority at least 51%. No, with the consensus and the algorithm, there is no minority. Also, who is contrary to the adoption of certain rules have to follow and to respect the rules given. Otherwise, there is the possibility to have a fork in the platform, but is a remote possibility. So the consensus modalities vary according to the type of the blockchain. And we have, again, something that we give us we are constrained, we are binded to go back to a form of decentralization, because you know how why miners do their work. Because they receive the fee called GAS, they receive token in exchange of their work. So for Bitcoin, so for the other platforms, and there is the research of a profit. Is very visible. This phenomenon is very evident for Bitcoin. If you think there are, especially in China, great factories in order to produce Bitcoin. So we have profit through mining. And third is not the less important of the 3 points. We have a rejection of the physical world because banks and governments are not willing to entrust their data and transaction to a public blockchain. So the solution, especially for the financial system, think of Corda or Hyperledger, is not a decentralized solution in terms of governance, but a sort of permissioned, as I told at the beginning of my speech. So we have, and I'm going to the end, sorry for the other panelists, but I think I'm speaking. I have been speaking since 25 minutes, so I'm going to close my speech. So we have this convergency. Blockchain is something that reminds of not only of technology, that is very similar. No, but I want to say later. Blockchain is a sort of, blockchain needs money, needs a form of governance in the sense of democracy, because there is this sort of idealist, as I told, decentralization, and technology as organization. Very similar to the classical notion in the legal theory of legal system. Very, very similar to legal system. So we remind, for the global public, blockchain, to the concept of sovereignty. Think of money, think of organization, think of democracy as the participants to the network, is very similar to the definition that we have in the legal theory. Think to, especially to Kelsen. Kelsen said there is no importance to have a definition of sovereignty, because if you have the power to issue rules and legislation, you are the sovereign. Yes, but in the blockchain is something very different. Is not the research of the Leviathan, is the way to escape from the Leviathan. But in this escaping, we find the problem that the human structure, the institution known, made by humans, tend to become again centralized. It's very difficult to maintain decentralized power. Why? It's very simple. Because, and I stop my speech because I take too much time, the problem is the enforcement. Who is in charge for the enforcement? Is this power under democratic legitimacy? We can say that at the beginning, as we were in a corporate, we give rules and then we respect the rules in a static way. Is it possible? Think of Bitcoin. You can issue only 21 millions of Bitcoins. It's a sort of mechanism, automatic. It doesn't matter if it refers or not to specific economic theories due to, as you know, the German or Austrian economist, von Mises specifically. No, it doesn't matter, because think of the 21 millions in terms of governance. There is no possibility to destroy or to modify this rule, and could be, in certain cases, could be unuseful to have a cap of issuing currencies. So it's not so, it's very difficult to make a comparison with the central bankers when we ask ourselves if they're legitimated to do certain operations on the capital market and the monetary systems, and on the other side to have a block to the issue of currencies, because money could be a function of to serve people for the economic welfare. So there is a problem of democracy in terms of legitimacy. And at the end, if you remember the legal notion of legal system, you have, in the case of a state, the Leviathan, the monopoly of legitimate power. And this monopoly of legitimate power could be decentralized. I think this is the question that we have to answer if we want to avoid that blockchain for a dream becomes something that is not similar to a dream, but to something that we have had already in the past. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Felipe. We have this conversation generally in Firenze. This is something that it's always going on in my mind, because it's a really problem, because we have to think about the structural institutions that we have right now. What is democracy? The democracy, or the idea of democracy, the idea of sovereignty that we have nowadays, is the one that we have to continue having, or we have to change the ideas of the premise. So it's really difficult to say right now, but it's really, really, really fascinating. And thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Right now, we are talking a little bit about this kind of problems, but it's a different point of view, a different issue or problem that related with this kind of governance in blockchain, directly from Leiden, Netherlands. Morshed Mannan will present some interesting points of reflections that was developed on a recent paper that he wrote in co-author with Primavera de Filippi and Vincent Rangers. I don't know if it's like this that I can pronunciation the other author, Morshed, but it's a difficult name. So the point that I think that he will give for us is that we always heard about that blockchain is a trustless machine. The provocation that Morshed brings is that blockchain actually is a confidence machine. And in this scenario, we have to deal with problems of trust, of some challenges of governance. And this is kind of problems that Morshed will talking a little bit with us right now. Morshed is a major PhD candidate attached to the Company Law Department, Institute of Private Law. His research on international insolvency law, corporate governance, freedom of establishment, corporate social responsibility, workers' cooperatives, blockchain, and international labor rights. He also lectured in Leiden's Advanced LLM International Business Law, LLB programs, research fellow of the Institute for the Cooperative Digital Economy at the New School. Morshed, welcome. The place is all yours for the next 25 minutes. Morshed, I think that you are without sound.
Hello, can you hear me?
Right now, yeah.
Yeah. If I have a moment, I can share my screen, right?
Yeah, sure.
1 minute. Sorry, it's just. Okay. I'm having a bit of a problem with sharing my screen.
Really? Let me try.
I sent it to you, so if you could open it, then I can just.
Yeah. I will do right now. Just a minute. And you can start. I will be.
Okay, so I actually was very interested by Professor Filippo's presentation and his particular remark about Carl Schmitt and Hans Kelsen. The article that I'm going to be talking about right now is actually a follow-up of an article that I wrote with Primavera de Filippi and some others about applying Hans Kelsen and Carl Schmitt's theory of sovereignty to public blockchains. And that was published by Topoi Journal a couple of years ago. And this is a sort of follow-up paper where we explore the concept of trustlessness, and we try to use sociological and philosophical theories on trust to try to distinguish trust from confidence, and then try to think of how governance can be used as a way of dealing with losses of confidence and breaches of trust. Of course, we see that trust and confidence are related concepts and they are mutually reinforcing, but we think it is fruitful to understand why they are different before designing governance solutions. And I will say at the end of my presentation a few words about what we are thinking about, in effect, constitution building for the rule of code. And there we draw on, ideas of polycentric governance theory that the Olsons have thought about in the past, but now reconsidering this for the blockchain space. So while the presentation comes up, I will quickly say a few introductory words about this. The past decade has seen a reinvigorated interest in the concept of trust. Could we go to the next slide? Yeah, so the past decade has seen a reinvigorated interest in the concept of trust, primarily driven by the onset of the global financial crisis, but for other reasons as well. So actions by governments around the world that have contributed to eroding trust in public authorities. We can see some examples here from the Intercept newspaper, but also as well as a lack of trust in online platforms and other major tech companies that have at times acted against the interests of their users and even been complicit in certain abuses committed by public authorities. So as a consequence, especially over the last decade, even more than a decade, we have seen this erosion of trust in both the state as well as in certain major corporations. So if we go to the next slide. So, this has usually been the narrative that has begun the discussion about blockchain technology and to sort of build the main narrative of what blockchain provides, what is its central property, that it is trustless. And you can see some other PowerPoint slides and economist inserts about what blockchain is. So the academic discussion only considers this central property from a negative perspective, that blockchain does not need trust to operate. There is little investigation into what blockchain provides instead of trust to operate. Our argument in the article that I'm speaking about is that instead of blockchain being a trust machine, it is a confidence machine. So if you could click just once. Yes. So in my presentation, I'll be expanding on this argument in 4 steps. First, that trust and confidence are distinct from each other, that trust depends on personal vulnerability and risk-taking, whereas confidence depends on internalized expectations derived from knowledge or past experience. Blockchain technology builds confidence because it creates shared expectations with regard to the manner in which it operates and the procedural correctness of this operation. Third, having said the above, there is still distributed trust in a public permissionless blockchain in a large number of unknown, often anonymous actors, and that has been alluded to a little bit by Professor Filippo. On certain occasions, such a Schmittian state of exception, this may lead to a diminution of confidence in blockchain itself. Fourthly, the existence of this distributed and in some cases opaque trust relationships necessitates governance interventions. And this is where polycentric and constitutional governance theories may offer a useful starting point for thinking about how do we improve the governance of permissionless public blockchains. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in this slide, I summarize some of the main differences that we draw between trust and confidence, but I will elaborate a bit. For some philosophers like John Locke, the existence of trust was fundamental for human societies to evolve and leave a state of nature. Trust has an important function in allowing persons to engage in a wide variety of activities without the need for direct supervision. But most scholars agree that trust inevitably comes with a degree of risk and vulnerability. There is always a possibility that the trustee will act in their own interest and not in the interest of the trustor. The centrality of risk and uncertainty to any definition of trust can be seen in Gambetta's definition of trust. He defines it as the subjective probability with which one agent assesses that another agent will perform a particular action independently of his capacity to be able to monitor it and in a context in which it affects his own action. So what this implicitly means is that preceding any trust relationship, one is making a choice between alternatives to make oneself vulnerable to another or not. Acting in confidence means that the actor is not choosing between alternatives. A consequence of this is that when there is a breach of trust, the trustor blames themselves in part for taking a risk, while a collapse of confidence is attributed to the actions of a third party or for some unforeseeable events. As such, some philosophers like Anthony Giddens view trust as involving a leap of faith that an actor is willing to take due to some psychological attribute, while others see this arising out of a rational choice made by the actor after assessing the trustworthiness of the trustee. Others, like the philosopher and lawyer Niklas Luhmann, acknowledge that there can be a more routine form of trust that arises out of familiarity rather than an explicit leap of faith. If we continue to pursue this rational choice perspective on establishing trust, then we can note that there are differences in how trustworthiness is gauged in individuals, institutions like corporations, and in technological arrangements, respectively. So for individuals, we build trustworthiness or we assess trustworthiness through repeated interactions with individuals, which make their actions more reliable, or we look at credentials provided by third parties that show that they are trustworthy. So we look at, for instance, credentials about someone's medical certificate, medical qualifications. For institutions, including, for example, corporations, we assess whether an institution will act in line with the interests of the trustor. Usually repeated interactions with representatives or delegates of an institution will be a proxy for this. And the trustworthiness of those who are designed and administer the institution will also be relevant for this assessment. In contrast, for technological arrangements, and this is where blockchain becomes relevant, typically this will involve merely assessing whether a technology has been designed in a way that it conforms to a set of prescribed rules. This, we argue, is not trust, but is actually confidence in the technology. Indeed, trust only comes into the picture when the technology has a third party involved in its operation and maintenance, where that third party has to be trusted. So in contrast to all of this discussion about trust, what is confidence? Confidence can be built if one is able to correctly analyze the technology, reliably predict its operation, and gain experience of its correct operation. This is because confidence is grounded in assurance and predictability rather than risk and uncertainty. The assurance stems from prior successful experience. Experience here again does not equal expertise. It is possible to be confident in the operation of something without detailed insight into how it operates at a technical level. So particularly in a complex technical system like an airplane, confidence emerges not just from knowledge of the mechanics of the airplane that keep the airplane airborne, but from reliance on the statistics of the relatively few flights that crash, on the expertise of engineers and pilots, and on the patchwork of regulations that ensure the integrity of the safety of aircraft. What this boils down to is that confidence is less attached to emotion than trust. In a sense, it is easier to build confidence as it requires only a change in the cognitive process of a single agent. So it doesn't require two persons' cognitive states to change. And at the same time, it is harder to lose confidence than trust as it requires a breach of expectations with respect to the broader context. So to put it concretely, if you think of the Watergate scandal involving Richard Nixon, his improper actions meant that the public lost trust in Richard Nixon. But if we think that there was a higher voter turnout in the next election following his resignation, we can see that there was still confidence in the broader democratic process. However, when confidence is lost for whatever reason, this leads to a questioning of the essential attributes and features of an institution in general, and not just in a particular institution, let's say the White House. Finally, the lack of addressability of confidence compared to trust is also a distinguishing factor between these two concepts. In brief, while an organization can be addressed through correspondence, the economy or society cannot be addressed in a letter. So before moving on to discussing trust and confidence in the context of blockchain systems, it is important to note that they have a mutually reinforcing concentric relationship. The airplane example shows this, with our confidence in the aviation sector is in part based on our trust in the expert systems that give qualifications to pilots and engineers, which in turn is contingent on our confidence in the qualification giving system. So if we did not have confidence in the qualifications given to pilots, then it would not be possible to trust pilots or engineers. They create the conditions for each other to exist, basically. As their fortunes are tied, appropriate governance structures can contribute to enhancing both trust and confidence. May we go to the next one? So here, I present like a stylized representation of blockchain as a confidence machine. And this draws on actually some of the things that Filippo mentioned, but it schematically provides it in a certain way. So it's our central claim that blockchain systems strive to maximize the degree of confidence in a system that has the indirect effect of reducing the need for trust. Trust is not entirely eliminated, but in an ideal scenario, a high level of confidence allows transactions to take place more easily as it reduces perceptions of risk. In the context of most software, if one can understand the code, it is theoretically possible to predict its output for any given input. This transparency, predictability, and reliability allows for the existence of confidence and less of a need for trust in the developers of the software. So if we take the example of Bitcoin, it's illustrative as anyone that is a participant in the Bitcoin network or anyone who knows anything about Bitcoin knows that 12.5 Bitcoins will be produced under certain conditions roughly every 10 minutes. This is because of certain things that are illustrated here. First, it's that there's the rigor and robustness of the cryptography that guarantees the rules of the protocol, as evidenced by the millions of people that have reviewed the protocol, as well as its resilience from being hacked. The other feature that adds confidence is that it has game theoretic and economic incentives that stimulate self-interest, financial self-interest, while also enabling mutual monitoring by allowing each participant to verify the transactions that have happened on the blockchain. This gives each actor, for example, a miner, less agency. And finally, this together creates the perception that blockchain acts in a deterministic manner. As such, confidence can be expected to be higher in a Bitcoin network than in the arbitrary opaque systems through which, for instance, fiat currencies are printed. And this is why blockchain appeals to a variety of sectors, from legacy supply chain management to the Internet of Things. On closer inspection, though, the need for trust and the need to trust creeps back in. May we look at the next slide? So if we view blockchains as being a socio-technical assemblage comprised of miners, validators, programmers, crypto and token holders, end users, and to a certain extent regulators, we can see that it reduces the need to trust any of them individually. But it does require a degree of trust in the network of actors that contribute to the blockchain's operation and maintenance. If we consider, for instance, the first 4 actors that are mentioned on this list, we can see how they can be centralized points of failure, maliciously or otherwise. So this can vary from collusion between mining pools to make a technical upgrade of a Bitcoin protocol, for instance. That has happened in the past with respect to upgrading the Bitcoin protocol. It can be that all the way to the insolvency of a crypto exchange. And the Mt. Gox one in Japan is a particularly famous one. And that's what the image refers to. So there you can see trust continuing to be a big issue in the broader socio-technical assemblage of blockchain. Continuing on, core developers and sometimes certain open source contributors can make use of informal norms to affect design choices about how the blockchain operates. But it is only certain core developers who will make choices about the contributions that are accepted or rejected into a core repository. So these seemingly technical decisions can end up having political and economic effects because it ends up affecting the value of a particular cryptocurrency. In exceptional situations, like an unplanned hard fork, there may be a need to trust token holders and that they will act in the interest of the blockchain network. And for those of you who are familiar with this, the attack of the DAO hack is a particular example of this. And finally, and this is a bit more tangential, but regulators and lawmakers also need to be trusted in this wider ecosystem because they craft legislation and rules concerning the use of blockchain or blockchain-based systems as they can affect the system's legitimacy. So something that might be allowed at some point might become illegal because of certain actions that the regulator takes. So in a sense, you can see trust creeping back in there as well. So this is why, if we can go to my last slide. So this is why good governance is so important for preventing the aforementioned actors acting in an untrustworthy manner and also undermining confidence in the blockchain as a whole. So this will probably require rule of law principles being translated into the cryptosphere. And if we look at the broader literature on the rule of law, we can think of, that the rules have to be clear, they have to be stable, they have to be clearly publicized, they have to be applied prospectively and not retrospectively, they have to be enforced fairly, they have to be enforced equally and evenly, and there has to be a fidelity to theories of fairness and justice, and so on. So we can easily imagine that some of what we're saying will be familiar to those of you who have been engaged in internet governance before. So about the domain, for instance, the domain name system of ICANN and how that has been governed and how that has evolved over the years. And especially it might seem appealing to think of this in the context of blockchain because some of the debates were quite similar. So it went from this idea that, okay, we have an issue that we are trying to create something decentralized, but it isn't really decentralized or multi-stakeholder, because initially, for instance, with ICANN, there was a strong connection with the US government, and that changed over time. And after 2016, that connection became very loose, and the independent association, the multi-stakeholder association of ICANN, was given more teeth in enforcing the duties of the board of ICANN. And so we see that through an iterative process, the governance of ICANN became more decentralized, so to speak. However, there are limits to this application of this, as blockchain by design lacks a single point of control or failure like the ICANN board or this ICANN association. The rules of a protocol, after all, are voluntarily adopted, and it is always possible for the participants in a blockchain network to exit or fork. So instead, we can consider blockchains to be polycentric systems of governance, where there are diverse overlapping clusters of influence instead of a centralized dominant authority, with each cluster enjoying a degree of decision-making authority. So these clusters act anonymously, but at the same time, they account for each other. And we can imagine all of these actors that I've mentioned also acting in this way. But there are also polycentric governance systems that have acted, have been present in the physical world for many years. So one example, and I've put an image of that as well, is how the New York City water supply is managed. The New York City watershed management system is an example where you have a nonprofit corporation, the state, so the New York State, the New York City, a federal body, and municipalities in the region in a bottom-up way managing their common resource. And they have a conflict resolution mechanism that they use another separate body for. And they also have agreed through a memorandum of association how they are going to be distributing their functions and roles and so on. And this memorandum of agreement is almost like a polycentric constitution. So while we can look at these as a way of trying to imagine how will we try to deal with some of the governance challenges that a public permissionless blockchain present without creating a centralized body, and thus creating the same problems that the blockchain was supposed to solve. And thus looking at polycentric governance, looking at the theories regarding constitutional governance of polycentric systems is very helpful. And so, for instance, something that the Memorandum of Association of this New York body has is it has general rules about the separation of powers, monitoring, conflict resolution, appeal mechanisms, rules for exit and entry, which you would need for any rule of law system. And it also has domain-specific rules. So it gives, for instance, certain people multiple roles, or it creates redundancies that you need for a common resource to be shared. So further research needs to be done on this. And this is what I would like to explore further in my next article on this topic, especially looking at constitutional theory. So thank you. I hope I didn't overrun my time.
Thank you, Morshed. Thank you very much for your contribution. Where the people can have access to your paper?
Oh, in the last slide, I gave a link to it. If you
okay, I'll share again.
Sorry.
Where is?
It's also open access, so anyone can download it.
Yeah. I will share just a little minute because where is the? Okay, it's here.
Yes.
So if anyone wants to have access, so just don't download it on this.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's it. Thank you very much for your time with us. Let me pass the space for Sophie Nappert. Now, this beautiful lady, directly from London, right? Will point out some concerns related to conflict resolutions. The reflection that Sophie will bring to us, it's about the use of blockchain technology to resolve conflicts generated in decision-making in the microcosm of the DLT platform itself. So Sophie Nappert has an extensive curriculum, as all our guests. Nowadays, she's an arbitrator in independent practice based in London. She is dual qualified as an advocate of the Bar of Quebec, Canada, and as a solicitor of the Supreme Court of England and Wales. Before becoming a full-time arbitrator, she pursued a career as and was head of international arbitration at a global law firm. She holds a degree in both common law and civil law from McGill University and a master's degree in law from King's College London. Anyway, one thing that I think it's good for me to point out, the other things that are available in their curriculum is that she was an award-winning lecturer and the first female recipient of the Global Arbitration Review Award for Best Speech in 2016. So Sophie, thank you very much for your time with us. The space is all yours for the next 25 minutes. Welcome.
Diana, thank you very much, and Andre as well for having me. My contribution will be practical. I'm an arbitrator, I'm in the trenches, and blockchain has a very practical impact on decision-making and conflict resolution. Andre has asked me to explore ODR, online dispute resolution, or blockchain-based dispute resolution as a form of governance, hopefully. I will do that again from a practical perspective, and I have here to say very transparently and with a great deal of admiration that I was considerably inspired and influenced by Morshed's and Dr. De Filippi's paper on trust and confidence, because of course dispute resolution is all about trust. It's all about parties trusting a system to provide a fair and just result. So this resonated enormously with me. So thank you, Morshed, for this. And I've put the link in the chat actually to your paper so that people can access it easily. I don't agree with everything, but it is very thought-provoking, and it allowed me. What I also like a lot about this topic of governance and the approach, the angle that was taken in Morshed's paper, is that I think we're starting to see a new approach to blockchain. Up to now, we have had very philosophical, ivory tower, rhetorical platforms of blockchain as the answer to all the ills of modern society and centralization. And now we're realizing that it is that, but it is also about the mess of human nature. And that's where governance comes in. Now, it seems to me, and I don't have particularly, I'm a little bit agnostic as to the ills or benefits of decentralization. I'm not one of those evangelists. I'm an observer of the blockchain phenomenon. And I embrace it because I can see that it has incredible potential. But in terms of the ills of democracy or otherwise, I remain a little bit agnostic. However, it seems to me quite clear that if this space is to survive, it is going to need governance of some sort. I believe it would be not only utopian, but probably self-destructive to pretend that this is a field that can carry on completely decentralized without any type of governance whatsoever. Now, Morshed has very well established the very various stakeholders and participants in the blockchain system. Very many human actors, both within and outside the system, the miners, the validators, the programmers, the token holders, the cryptocurrency holders, the end users, and even, as he says, the regulators. Some of these areas present a number of people with a set of interests, of purposes, and of intentions that are different, that may converge, but that are very multiple. The other thing about blockchain is that it is at the moment premised on an aligned incentive of maximum economic gain that apparently drives everyone involved. Now, that drive only works up to a point. And that point is where those various interests diverge or collide, or where actions by those stakeholders are motivated in a physical or political theorem that does not easily translate into economically advantageous terms. For example, you could have a miner acting in a way that is selfish. You could have, on the opposite side, you could have one of those actors acting in a completely altruistic way against his better economic incentive. So those motivations are at odds with the current underpinning of the blockchain system. And that is why we need to have some sort of governance that allows the system to maintain and flourish. Now, I've been asked, as I said, to consider the question of whether ODR, online dispute resolution, or on blockchain, I would say, dispute resolution would serve as a form of governance. And here I want to talk about trust. The question of whether a dispute resolution is effective as a mechanism of order rests on issues of trust. Do users trust that the system will yield a fair and just result? In a state-run legal system, traditional legal system within a democratic society, the answer to this question relies on vectors of impartiality, even-handedness, transparency, and predictability. Now, already we have in traditional legal systems, in parallel, private forms of dispute resolution, catering to disputes that arise within certain communities, more or less tightly defined. So this is how arbitration was developed, for example. At the origin, arbitration was a system of justice for merchants, by merchants, in a given trade or industry, alongside the state court system, because they were looking for pragmatic, industry-led outcomes, less of a legalistic view of the world. That's how arbitration started. eBay is a very good example of a successful ODR platform solving low-value, high-volume disputes between buyers and sellers of its community. Now, there are what is it that makes these systems work? These private systems, these parallel systems. What is it that makes them gel? And there are, to my mind, two essential features to their legitimacy and their success. And it is the buy-in of users. The users have to go for it and use it for it to work. The willful exercise of choosing that system is obviously the start. And as a secondary factor, those users choose it because somehow they feel that they belong to a community. They belong to a group of people with broadly aligned purposes and interests, and the interests of keeping that community functioning in an orderly manner. It has famously been observed by Colin Rule, who is the person who devised the eBay ODR system, that system failed in other arenas because the sense of community was not as strong. The people involved were not that invested. They did not really care whether the system carried on or not. And so the ODR mechanism of solving disputes was not as trusted and was not as effective. So what does this tell us for blockchain governance? It says that it is essentially driven at the moment by the economic and game theory incentives that are coded in the protocol. And it is also driven by the social norms that bring the network participants to converge towards what they call the Schelling point in game theory, which is the belief that others decide in a certain way and everyone will decide as a consensus. It is a system that is where there is an acknowledgement by all individuals that others will react in a certain manner because they belong to that community. Now, here I will make a little parenthesis. It's not completely on point, but it strikes me as interesting that the blockchain dispute resolution systems that already exist, and I'm going to talk about them in a minute, as well as the ODR system of eBay, all depend on human judgment. The people who decide are humans. They're not algorithms. They're not machines. And I wonder whether the fact that these jurors are human for the time being has a direct correlation with trust. And the minute that you put machines or algorithms in charge of decision-making, whether that will not morph trust into confidence in the way that Morshed was positing a little bit earlier on. I have no answer to this. It's simply something that popped into my head as I was preparing this paper. But there is something interesting in the fact that it is still good old-fashioned humans who are making decisions on blockchain dispute resolution as we speak. So what are they, those that exist at the moment? They are at an experimental stage. They are applications that sit notably on the Ethereum blockchain. And what they do is they provide for the resolution of mostly, at the moment, crypto-related disputes, the listing of tokens, for example, and whether these meet with certain criteria, but that have the potential of scaling up to more mainstream commercial disputes on the e-commerce platform, low value, high volume. So how do they do it? They do it by randomly selecting some stakeholders on the blockchain, people who self-select, who indicate their intention of being drawn as jurors by staking a certain amount of money and saying, I'm available to decide disputes, choose me randomly, but you are randomly chosen amongst a group of people who have put in enough money. It's as if I were paying to be on a list of arbitrators, essentially. So these jurors pass judgment on smart contract disagreements according to what is a coded matrix of predetermined outcomes and in accordance with a system whereby they are rewarded, monetarily rewarded for coming to a consensus, and they are penalized financially if they dissent. It is a service that is being dubbed decentralized justice. Those decisions may be appealed by, let's say, the parties, of course, but not only the parties, by the jurors themselves. Those who were penalized for having dissented can decide themselves to appeal the decision. Now, it is a very clever concept on paper. It is a premise difficult to refute, that those conflicts, those disputes, just cannot afford to go to arbitration or the courts as we understand them today. The costs involved, the delays involved, the amount of money at stake just doesn't fit with the system as it exists. So it's a very attractive alternative on paper. It presents several challenges, as you might imagine, ethical and practical. And I will just outline a few to show that as a means of governance of the system, as they exist, they can only go so far. The first challenge is that it's a form of justice that is, it's private justice, of course, but it is pegged on game theoretical incentives of maximizing economic gain, as opposed to looking for fairness. Now, I'm told by the evangelist of these systems that on the whole, the type of disputes, the crypto disputes that are being discussed, that are being decided at the moment on these systems, on the whole turn out to be fair as well as game theory motivated, and that the two align. Fine. I have a question mark as to when the types of disputes scale up to something more mainstream in the commercial, or are more complex, or are more than just binary, pay the claimant, don't pay the claimant, when they become more complex. I really ask myself the question whether game theory and Schelling point is going to be a sufficient proxy for fairness. I have my doubts about that, but that would be me. But it is an interesting challenge as a form of governance to peg everything on maximizing financial gain. Another of these challenges is that this is a system that encourages what I call the objectivization of justice for private gain. So the parties' disputes is no longer at the center of this system. It's almost incidental. It's a pretext to make money. And it is, the parties' dispute is no longer central the way that it is in systems that we know in traditional law, to the point that the parties lose control of their appeals. If a juror decides, I don't like this decision, even if the parties like it, I'm going to appeal it. The third challenge is essentially the interaction of this system with the rest of the world. Because one of the difficulties with blockchain more generally, and that's a challenge of governance as writ large, is that it has functioned very much, I wouldn't say in a hermetical space, completely closed off, but it's pretty much its own world. It has even its own language. When you have a dispute resolution system and decisions that come out of this, these decisions at the moment have to be taken off chain for enforcement. And enforcement has been mentioned by my co-panelists, and it's absolutely the biggest challenge and the biggest reason for governance is to be able to transport these decisions into the real world and make them enforceable and valid. So scaling up is of the blockchain dispute resolution is a major, major challenge. It is one that will benefit from governance. From what I see at the moment, I think a soft form of governance will benefit at the decentralized space that is blockchain. It will work better. It will be better accepted by the stakeholders and by the actors. And I think that dispute resolution is, if not the only solution for governance, a very important one. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Very, very interesting points of view and provocations and things and things that we have to think of and will be popping in all minds of everyone that is listening. I have no doubts about that. So for the final part, I will give the space for my colleague André Gusco, because I think that he has some questions for our guests, right, André?
Right. First of all, I want to thank all the panelists. The presentations were very rich and showed us 3 different angles of what it seems to be the same problem. The problem of governance of blockchain could be examined by different angles. And saying this, I'm sorry, my neighbor is doing reforms. Is profiting from the quarantine to doing some reforms in his apartment. But I will pass to a question that was posed by a friend, by a colleague that participates in our discussion group. And it's Courtney Guimarães that asked to Sophie the following question. So Miss Sophie, based on our deep knowledge on arbitration chambers, how much do you think a global chamber for commercial contracts can be effective among companies if we have a neutral place, Geneva-like, to solve any possible questions? He is mentioning the trade lens efforts.
Thank you very much. I know what trade lens is. I'm obviously not that familiar, but I think the idea of a global chambers, you mean for dispute resolution relating to commercial contracts, I guess is the question. That would be very similar to what we have now by way of arbitration institutions, I guess, where you have a convergence of, or a hub for the resolution of disputes. I think that's a little bit too close to what we have right now, I think, to be acceptable to the blockchain stakeholders. It's a little bit too similar, and it's a centralization of power that I think many would find perhaps a little bit unsettling. I also asked the question whether, sorry, I also have difficulties, just a second. There's a lot of ambulances in the road just outside of me. I also wonder, coming back to the question of community that I was raising a little bit earlier on, I wonder whether the approach of dispute resolution should not be very much community-based, and something a little bit more global maybe would be one step further than that, once we have a better acceptance of blockchain dispute resolution as a concept. I think the question, the trust of users will come from starting with smaller communities, testing the validity of the dispute resolution concept, and then perhaps when that is tested and trusted, to converge on a more central commercial contract dispute system. That would be my, I don't know what my co-panelists think, but that would be my reaction.
I don't know if Filippo and Morshed could make some contribution on this top. If not, I will try to pose another question based on pickings from every panelist presentation. Morshed has mentioned that the need, the possible, or the discussion on the need on building on our constitution, building for the role of code. Filippo mentioned also the problem and the need to escape Leviathan, to use the blockchain in a way to escape Leviathan. And Sophie mentioned all the incentives, the economic incentives, the game theory incentives, and the relations with the real world, with the ODR awards. And considering all these three principles, these three aspects of the discussion on blockchain governance, we can say that we are definitely dependent on the state's regulation in order to enforce a constitution for the blockchain, because we private blockchains, of open blockchains, we are not capable of enforce some principles, or will not be able to enforce principles to the blockchain governance, and to create some legal incentive and legal guidance on the governance of the blockchain platforms. I don't think, I don't know who can start with the trying to answer some.
I mean, it's not an answer, it's a question, of course.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, but I would just ask, who would have the legitimacy to do that? I think that's a central question, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the problem of the distributed, the decentralized systems of governance. You don't have criteria to choose who's going to decide. And then all the discussions on governance on blockchain, and but this is one of the problems. This is one of the challenges that we face when we study and we try to understand blockchain governance.
If I might interject here,
please.
to talk about something that I'm working on right now. I'm working on a project with some others on called on a DAO model law. So it's a model law for decentralized autonomous organizations. And this actually raises some of these same issues about who would have legitimacy to adopt this model law and who would be the audience for this sort of a model law. Because the idea of, even drafting a model law with, the group is called Koala, and there's a little bit of information online, and I'm just thinking of how to talk about it without divulging too much of what we're working on. But the essence of it is that, from the time that the first DAO was attacked, there is a need to be able to deal with liability issues, for instance, as well as the enforcement issues that Sophie mentioned. And so the idea of a DAO model law is to basically create greater legitimacy for DAOs. But the interesting thing there is that for a lot of the discussion of how to draft this, one approach is to try to target people who are trying to create DAOs and say that this is what you would need to do to be able to operate in a legal system and be compliant with, for instance, their securities law. Or the other approach is that you look at, for instance, the work of the Organization of American States, which you would be familiar with in Brazil, and you look at, for instance, how the Simplified Stock Corporation was created from Colombia, and then they created a model act based on this in the OAS. So do we create something like this and then hope that member states of, let's say, depending on who you would approach, those states will adopt it, and then the model law would become part of their corporate law. So there are different ways of doing this and different authorities that you are trying to keep in mind. One option is private, one option is to go the very traditional route of how model laws are adopted in arbitration, but also in corporate law. And I think that itself, and the fact that this discussion is happening and including actors who are very, involved in the blockchain space, in this regard, shows that there is this consideration of who would be, the most legitimate person to go to for these sorts of new policy changes, but at the same time, not compromising on the ambition of being, distributed to give a maximum degree of flexibility to new DAO projects as well, so that they can innovate, even not just in terms of the products that they make, but also, or the services they provide, but also in how they govern themselves. So this is a very live discussion that is happening even in this very specific field of blockchain governance, I'd say.
Can I just interject, Andre, here, please? Morshed, thank you very much for sharing that. I think that's it's a fascinating piece of information and development, and I find it surprising that the idea of a model law is even being contemplated. You cannot think of a more traditional way of putting governance in a system than with a model law, and the model law to be adopted by whom? By nation states, to put into their law. So that raises the question: what law applies on the blockchain? What is the governing law? Yes, everything that the blockchain wanted to get away from. That said, I can very well see the very valuable work that will be put into that as being, as having, to my mind, perhaps even more repercussion if it were conceived not as a model law, but as a piece of soft law, as a piece of, best practice or accepted practice, or that has the buy-in of several stakeholders. I don't know what you think.
I'll put in the chat the public-facing piece that we have already on this. That gives, this was written a while ago, but it still gives a summary of what we are working on. But exactly, I think there has been a huge issue of how to frame this and whether it will, in the end, be a model law in the sense of, for instance, an uncitral model law, or whether it will take on a different shape. It's partly, a process where you learn by working with very new, different groups of people, let's say. But yeah, the fact that there is a recognition of this is very interesting. Yeah.
And if I may contribute with the discussion, we must consider the aspect that a model law of some set of best practice recommendations must address also all the difference in different blockchain platforms. We have cryptocurrencies, we have platform for supply chain and tracking and so on. So the different uses for the blockchain technology imposes different considerations on different regulations on that. Do you think that this makes sense, or we have to have a unified model to regulate blockchain, considering being cryptocurrencies and other kind of a blockchain for identity, for example?
I may, Andre. Oh no, Sophie, please.
No, Filippo, please go ahead.
Absolutely.
I've been speaking way.
Before women.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, I just wanted to reply also to Courtney's point, saying that blockchain is not about not wanting law, and I wanted to just clarify this is not what I meant. Of course, all I meant with my comment earlier on the model law, it was that if you are imposing it as a model law, it might trigger the reaction of precisely walking away from it and choosing the law of a state that hasn't acceded to it if it doesn't have general buy-in, whereas if it is a piece of soft law, it probably will have a better chance of being accepted. I just wanted to make that clear. Sorry.
Thank you all. It's very, very interesting. And let me try to make a mix of what you said. From a theoretic point of view, if I should. First of all, it's very interesting what Andre said. Blockchain, yes, think of what Sophie has said for last. Blockchain is very useful in order to create a private jurisdiction, as in the case of arbitrator, and to manage the alternative dispute resolutions. But why do we need this kind of arbitrage, this kind of jurisdictions? Sophie said very well, for the so-called lex mercatoria, the lex of the merchants. So it was very useful and was developed, especially after the 90s of the last century, for the development of a governance architecture for the global world, the global economy. Blockchain arose, the use of the technology arose to escape from that kind of Leviathan. Not for the use, obviously, of the alternative dispute resolution, but for the effect of the global economy on people of better communities. This is the great problem. I think this is the most prominent problem. And it's very interesting what Morshed said about the distinction between confidence and trust. But let me say again that confidence reminds of a public notion, public law notion. You are confident that there is an authority that gives you the possibility to be protected, to be assured of something. So when you think of the term confident, you think of the idem sentire of a community. It's very simple. Here in Europe, I'm the only one. Yes, you as a British, you have a few months before exiting, but I'm the only one now.
Canadian, not British.
I know that, Sophie, but I don't know for how many months also I can say that too. But I'm the only one here to be part of the European Union. We don't talk about the possibility to have a federal system. We have a governance system because there is not a state in the common sense, in the Leviathan sense, but it's very similar to a Leviathan in a sort of way because there is not political, obviously, trouble. I don't want to put in trouble the kind hosts of this meeting, but obviously there are countries that are more powerful than the others inside this union. So we have the only way, think how the European Union functions works, the only way is to reach not, it's very difficult to have the all the same voters. So the majority is not so good for, especially for the most important rules of the treaties and so on of the European Union. So we have a sort of privilege, I don't know how to say, 3/4. There is a sort of percentage. Unanimity is impossible to reach often. So we have another solution. This is governance. So I think the problem could be this one, Andre. You said there is with the regulation of blockchain, we vice versa go back to the nation states and the regulation at the state level, if I understand what you mean. Yes, because we don't face till now the problem of the private law aspects. Private law aspects remain in the power of the nation states. Also, not only in the European Union, where there is a sort of division of competencies between the member states, but also in the federal system. Think, for example, United States, you have in Wyoming a special regulation for crypto asset, very different from the others. So the problem is to have not the soft law solution, as we try also this time to reach out, giving a much power to organization. I note in the contrary of obviously International Standard Organization and the other ancestral and so on, but they were born to introduce standards for the application of legislation, not to do legislation. Is another thing to do legislation. So I think we have, first of all, we have the duty, not us, unfortunately, but our government, to face the problem of a common private law jurisdiction. This is a great problem. I can interpret in legal terms a crypto asset in different way if I am established in the United Kingdom, the United States, in Brazil, and in Italy, and so on. We have to reach the same private law profile. And this is very difficult because we have very different legal system, and obviously there is the great distinction between common law and civil law. But I think this is the next effort is to do that, especially at European level, but I think also in Brazil and in the Southern America, to have common legislation at the private law level. First consideration before stopping myself is very, if you think to the distinction made by Morshed between trust and confidence, you see the distinction between private law and public law. Think of what is written on the US currency, the fiat money of dollar. In God we trust. So the problem is we have a lack of confidence in the nation state or in the legal system in order to aim the objectives of the Constitution given by the constitutions. Last consideration, really, it is a mistake to search through governance the possibility to escape from these inevitably obstacle that we have to to climb, okay, to jump, because interoperability is a sort of, is a sort of mechanism as we ask for, especially in the 30s of the last century, for international law in order to solve these problems. But interoperability is not the unique mechanism that you can use in order to recreate an harmonization of the different jurisdictions. So I think it's very strange because it's very different from what the especially the developers thought at the beginning of the blockchain and the crypto space. But I think we need more law in the sense that a new way to interpret private legal matters. Just one sentence before concluding my intervention is a sentence coming from the MIT researcher David Clark, internet engineering task force member, and he said at the beginning of the construction of the blockchain platforms, we reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. And I think this is a problem because rough consensus is something that we can't accept, and at the same time is inevitably, because kings, presidents, and voting failed.
Well, yeah, I think that the question that the professor brings, it's one of, or the most important one when we're talking about regulation, this technology, or it's not the technology that are being regulated, it's actually the application of the technology, the operations that happens with this technology, and how we interpret this kind of operations. And more than that, Professor, if I may do some considerations, how can we establish nexus of jurisdiction, because we have these kind of problems because our international system were building up in idea of sovereignty linked by territoriality. I am Brazilian, I am in Brazil, I do my things in Brazil, so Brazilian's law applies to me. But when we are talking about operations that happens in a space, in multiple space, how we can how can we negotiate new nexus of jurisdiction, and how we negotiate an harmonization in these new kinds of agreements? It's new agrees that probably have to be done with the states. I don't know, it's something that I'm thinking about sometimes about this. What do you think, I'm André?
Yeah, that's true. And this is the real problem. And I refer to a question made by Courtney, the classical question, the every revolving question on if code can be law, if code is law, who makes the code, who makes the law? And Sophie has mentioned that is very interesting in this topic is, and that's the kind of, if we let the governance of blockchain platforms only to the platform, or we have only on-chain governance models, on-chain governance mechanisms, we can resort to this kind of discussion. The code will be law, and who makes the code, how the code's made, how is decided to make the code. I think Sophie is very eager to say a word about this.
I don't know. It's a topic that requires a lot of time and a cool head. I would say it's a little bit the discussion that you have in the common law system about black letter law. Black letter law being a very rigid interpretation of the texts. And the problem with code being law, as I understand it at the moment anyway, is that you have a concentration of coders amongst maybe not a handful, but very few individuals. And to give that much power to as few individuals as that, to me, is dangerous. And apart from anything else, runs against the ethos of blockchain. And so for code to be law, you would need the equivalent of equity, which to temper the excesses that code. And it again, I mean, Morshed mentions in his paper the DAO attack. That's a very good example of code being law, and the fact that someone runs away with millions of dollars because there was a flaw in the code. Well, so be it. He can't, that person cannot be penalized for having done that because code is law. There is a problem with that. There's a moral problem with that. There's a fairness problem with that. And that comes back to my question about, where does fairness fit in code? I cannot be more enlightened than that. I'm sorry.
If I might add like a small point here, and this is more based on my PhD research, where I've been doing case studies of cooperatives, because my research is more about what role cooperatives can have in democratizing the platform economy. And some of the case studies I've done involve cooperatives that are using blockchain technology in very interesting ways. So if I speak of one, and that might be familiar to those of you, well, to you, Sophie, because you're from Quebec, it's called Eva Cooperative, and it's a cooperative alternative to Uber. And the way they use the EOS blockchain is quite interesting because one, it doesn't use proof of work; it uses a delegated proof of stake. On top of that, even though in its initial white paper it had all of these points regarding, distributing tokens and so on, I think once they started realizing the problems with ICOs that emerged at the same time as that white paper was written, they scaled back on these ambitions and they use blockchain in a much more limited way, in the sense that it's mainly used for now to store certain information about the user and the driver and the rider. And it's used for a privacy function, basically. And so that there's a limitation of how much information is actually shared with Eva. And what I think is interesting and why it relates to this point about whether code is law is that if we think that you can only deal with certain amount of governance issues through, let's say, black letter law or technical language, so there's only a limited amount you can deal with on-chain, that means that there's going to be a lot that is dealt with off-chain. And then there's the question of whether you use informal norms to resolve these questions, or whether you formalize it by having, for instance, something like a cooperative, where you have like an existing democratic governance structure that already exists, and you can empower people through membership rights, and you have a body of jurisprudence on this, but you have basically a governance structure that then tells you, okay, how do you deal with the off-chain part? And it sort of, again, I think really reflects how we have a concentric relationship between, this on-chain governance, off-chain governance, and then, the wider public governance that Filippo refers to.
Well,
10 seconds, Diana. I think I'm not contrary on the beautiful book of Primavera de Filippi and the Code is Law, obviously, but many times told to Primavera that I prefer to Code is Law, Code as Law. I think is better.
Well, we have to finish because our time is on the end. I want one more time to thank you so much for you three, for your time, for your share with us your knowledge about these topics. It's a fascinating team. We can stay here for hours and hours talking about this. So thank you very much for this. I will open for 1 or 2 minutes for each one, that if you want to do your final considerations, and then we have to stop the transmission. So thank you one more time for your attention to be here with us. I will start with Sophie, and then Morshed, and then Filippo. The way contrary to the speech.
Thank you very much. I don't have much to say to finish. I think what this tells me is that it is a space that requires a great deal of dialogue and a great deal of thought. And it is, thank you for providing us with this evening. And I'm very grateful for my co-panelists and their depth of thought on this. Thank you.
I would like to, yes, I would also like to thank the co-panelists for bringing 2 different and very important perspectives on this topic. If I had to add anything, I would just say that one area that seems to be discussed less compared to others when we talk about the law, blockchain, and governance is specifically like the law of business organizations. So I mentioned cooperatives, but I think corporate law generally is discussed less as in comparison to, let's say, dispute resolution, of course, property law, security law, all of these other areas. And I think that's a very fruitful area of inquiry, because there's a lot that we can explore about the role that blockchain can have in corporate governance, cooperative governance, and so on. But while there are some people writing about this, I think it could be, something that is very interesting, I think, both for academics and practitioners.
Thank you again to the organizers of this fascinating talk, fascinating meeting, and thank you especially to the co-panelists. And it was a great opportunity to exchange ideas with them. And finally, I want to say that we need more research on blockchain and the blockchain and the related issues. So please study blockchain as a legal, as a lawyer, as a jurist, as a judge, as everything, but study it. And so I think we'll solve all these problems for a better future for all humanity.
Thank you to both of you a lot, and the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Andrea, do you want to talk to give some final words?
Just a final word to thank all the panelists. Thank you for sharing their time and their knowledge with us. And I think this kind of discussion, this kind of interchange of ideas and different views from different parts of the world is very fruitful also, because we can consider different realities and different point of views and different cultures, even different cultures to tackle with this common problem.
Thank you very much. Good night for you. Good evening for us. Bye. See you soon. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.